Let's go with item number 1, which is our pension presentation. And assuming that I'm going to look down there. Now, is the mayor here? Okay.
Be present to speak.
You can speak for him.
Mr. Mayor, Collins and Director Robinson, we are ready. Paper, because I know there might be a conversation. Welcome, Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon to the members. I will be very brief. I hope and trust that all of you did receive an advanced copy of the presentation that Mr. Collins and other members of the staff will make. We do have here Mr. Jerry Dubner, who's a Price Wharton and has been the city's actuary for 28 plus years. Since he is not here every day, we will be as brief as possible. So if there are questions that members of the council might have to Mr. Dubner, who's to my left here, since he's in town today, we'd much prefer that he made have turned over, you made available to you, but we will always be around to answer questions. With that, I'm going to turn it over to CAO George Little for a few comments, followed by Finance Officer Brian Collins. And again, there was no news here. It's in the package that has been distributed previously. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Chief.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The purpose of this afternoon's presentation is primarily informational. You're not asking for action today. Another step in what's been an ongoing process. Director Collins has shared an overview of the initial findings from PwC as they relate to the pensions. And so today we're going to go into further detail with respect to that, as well as what we believe to be the appropriate response to the findings that PwC had. We feel that this issue of pension is important to preserve the benefit for our current retirees. Given the current unfunded liability and the future liabilities under our existing plan, we feel that action is necessary to assure that we can continue to meet the obligations that we have established for those retirees. We also feel that action is necessary at this time to preserve pensions for our current vested employees under our existing plan, again, in terms of the financial stability of the plans. Moreover, we feel that action is necessary to assure the financial solvency of the city. The implication of pensions, as we've seen all across the United States, not just here in Memphis, but at the local level and at the state level, is such that pensions can directly affect our ability to raise capital or even to meet some of our other ongoing operational expenses. We feel that action is necessary to place us on a predictable fiscal path, particularly as we look not only to fiscal year 15, but going out over roughly a 5-year horizon. And I would be remiss if I didn't touch on action is needed now so that we can be assured that we're masters of our own fiscal fate. As we've already seen earlier in this calendar year, in terms of some of our interaction with the state comptroller, inquiry that we've received from the State Pension Board, and certainly legislation that was proposed in the last session of this General Assembly, matters of local fiscal solvency are certainly at the forefront of discussions in the General Assembly and in Nashville, and we would much rather take actions so that we can make our own choices as opposed to be locked into some construct that somebody else has developed 200 miles up the road. We have been in this process of reviewing the pension now going back for a couple of years, and specifically since we received the PwC report. It's been shared widely with a whole host of bodies. The mayor has been out meeting with employee groups. I have been meeting with the employee associations. We've had several sessions. We've exchanged information. We've had our actuaries talk to They're actuaries, and for those of us who weren't actuaries, we sort of zoned out until the actuaries came together, and I suspect we'll have some more discussion of the numbers. That's not to say I wasn't engaged, Mr. Governor. Some things were just like way over my head. I think what we could all agree is that there is a problem. We may disagree as to the magnitude of the problem and the underlying assumptions associated with that. We may disagree as to the solutions. I do think that there was general agreement that the city contributions over the last several years have not been adequate, particularly with regard to making up for what happened to the valuation of our assets when the stock markets and the economy slowed down. And so that brings us to today. We've engaged in this transparent process, and we feel it's now time, one, to clarify where we are, and two, to clarify what we think needs to be done to begin the next steps in this journey. We want to do so in a way that's open not only today but going forward, and engaging our employees, our employee associations, and various community stakeholders, and obviously in a continued dialogue with this body. With that said, I'd like to recognize our Director of Finance, Brian Collins, who will lead this discussion along with our Director of Human Resources, Quentin Robinson. At the appropriate time, we'll introduce a representative who is here from Price Waterhouse for any questions that this body may have. Director Collins.
Thank you. Thanks, Chief. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I'm going to try to keep this divided into three major sections. I'm going to start out by talking about where we've been, what the pension fund looks like today, a little bit of history on how we got there and where we believe we are today. Then I'm going to move into really the administration's recommendation about how we believe the pension plan has to change going forward. Then the third part of what I'm going to talk about is how that impacts the entire city budget and city finances and what we're going to have to do over the next 5 years and beyond to right the ship and keep our fiscal house in order. So I'll get right into it. If you could switch to the first slide. The first slide I have up here is really a slide that many of you have already seen. This is a slide that I pulled out of the PricewaterhouseCoopers presentation that we gave you back in September. And what this is a history from '08 through the present of what's happened with our whole situation with our fund. And I'm going to start out by walking you through 2008 to set you up for what happened thereafter when we had the Great Recession. Now, when we think about where we stand, we always look at what our funded status is. Are we overfunded, underfunded, or are we right on the money? Back in 2008, things were relatively good for Memphis. We had actuarial assets. This is a representation of, one way to think about this is, what did we have in the bank? What did the fund look like? Back at that time, we were just under $2.2 billion. The actuarial liability, moving from left to right, the actuarial liability is one way to think about it is the present cash value of all of the future obligations that the pension fund has. And they go out 50 or more years. And back in 2008, the present value of all those future obligations to our pensioners was estimated to be just over $2 billion. So as of that moment in time, the pension fund was more or less on track. It had a slight surplus. As the chief said, though, the world changed for the pension fund and for everybody very dramatically in 2008 into 2009 when we had the banking collapse, the real estate collapse, and that affected portfolios across the board. And what we had, as you can see, the actuarial assets in this column in 2009 dropped from almost $2.2 billion down to under $1.8 billion. That was a very substantial hit. Aside from that, the actuarial, or rather the liabilities, of course, they are not a function of what happens in the marketplace. The liabilities that we have continue to grow. So in that same year that we lost many hundreds of millions of dollars in assets, our liabilities continue to increase. So in the space of 1 year, we had a nearly $500 million change in position from where we had been the year before, from almost a $100 million surplus to almost a $500 million deficit. And we went from a funded ratio of over 100% to under 80%. Now, from 2009 on, the situation continued to deteriorate. Although assets began to recover somewhat, and over those years they have recovered from year to year, our liabilities have continued to grow. So as you can see, the unfunded liability grew from $450 million to today, when the estimate for the unfunded liability in our pension fund is now over $700 million, and our funded ratio is now down to almost 70%. If we continue on this track, you can imagine that this unfunded liability is going to continue to grow unless we do something about it. Will you please switch to the next slide. What this is a slightly different look at the same phenomenon. Instead of looking at what the total unfunded liability was, what this does is give us sort of a look at ground level of what that meant year by year. So going back to 2008, when things were still good, the city was contributing about 5% of salaries to the pension fund. Employees were contributing approximately 8%, and that year the annual required contribution, or what we call the ARC, was approximately $20 million. The city's funding of that at a 5% of salary was $16 million. And if you recall from the last slide, we were still okay, although we were technically underfunding slightly. Well, what happened is in the next year, 2009, again, the market did its thing and crashed very significantly. The contribution that our actuaries told us we would have to make to begin the catch-up process, to begin to refund and return our pension fund to a totally funded status, meant that we had to up, or we should have, if we could have, increased from in the $20 million range up to the $70 million range. So in 1 year, because of the market quake, if you will, our annual required contribution jumped by $50 million. If you recall, that was the same time that there was a lot going on with the school system, the litigation, et cetera, and there was a lot of talk in City Council about could we possibly raise taxes to pay for this? And I think the consensus back then must have been that given the fragile state of the economy, we were going to ride this one out. So no action was taken. 2 years later, in 2010, the amount that we contributed was changed by ordinance from 5% to 6%, slightly increasing the city's contribution. But nonetheless, each year as our actuaries recalculated what it would take to get us back on track, what it would have taken to get us back on track continued to grow from 70 million to 80 million to 90 million, till today we are at nearly an annual required contribution of almost $100 million. So that is more or less where we're at today. Could you go to the next slide? We've been looking at our pension plan for quite a while, and we've talked to our actuaries. We've given a lot of thought to why is it that this happened? What is it about our pension plan that caused this? And it's defined benefit plans have certain risks that the city or anybody, an employer, a state, anybody that's funding a defined benefit risk can't avoid these. And they can cause a lot of variability from year to year. Interest rate risk, market risk, mortality risk, and inflation risk. Over time, we always, in our plan, we guarantee a certain outcome, but we don't have control over these. For instance, interest rates can go up very substantially, something we cannot control. If interest rates go up substantially, all the value of the bonds that we hold in our portfolio can drop very substantially. causing a drop in the asset value and creating a deficit on our unfunded liability. Market risk, this is the more general market risk, and this is what happened in 2009, where there is a really broad-based drop across the board in real estate, equities, you name it, it can go down. That's what happened to us in 2009. Also, built into a defined benefit plan is something called mortality risk. Over time, remember that our plan was initially conceived back in the 40s. And back in the 40s, life expectancies were probably still in the 60s, if not high 60s. Over time, they have increased. And as life expectancies increase, every time that happens, what we've guaranteed goes up, but what's in the fund doesn't necessarily increase with that. So we take that risk. And then we also have inflation risk. Inflation can happen at any time. For those in the room who are old enough to recall last time there was double-digit inflation, what can happen to us in an inflationary period is that salaries can jump in harmony with hyperinflation. If that were to happen down the road, our obligations to pay pension benefits would be tied to those final year-end salaries, and there could be a very substantial uptick in what we owe. So there are a lot of risks associated with being in a defined benefit plan, and what we found out in 2009 is that those risks can be very severe, very substantial, and very disruptive. Out of nowhere, we can have the bill for our pension plan jump, in our case, by $50 million in a single year. And it's our position that that's the kind of pension plan that we ought not to be in if we are going to be able to deliver a consistent level of city services from year to year. We just can't afford to be faced with those occasional jumps, and they will come. Recessions come every decade or more. So the concern that we have is that if we continue on this path, 2008 and 2009, that period, it's going to happen again. So we want to try and minimize that. If you could switch to the next slide, please. To sort of sum all of this up, we asked our actuaries to look at this, look at how we have been funding our plan, and the conclusion that they reached, and I've reached, and I think everybody that's looked at this has reached, is that our pension plan as we're currently funding it is just unsustainable. And that unsustainable situation has caught the eye of a lot of folks, not the least of which is the controller of the state of Tennessee. And I won't read these back to you verbatim, they're in your packages, but we have been told in no uncertain terms that this is a big issue and that we have got to face it. We cannot put this off any longer. As this liability continues to grow, we risk, as the mayor and Chief Little said, we run the risk of the comptroller stepping in and looking at our budget and saying that we no longer have a balanced budget if we don't come up with a plan to start paying down this unfunded liability. So what the chief said is absolutely real. It is just on the horizon if we don't get on this and get on it quick. Can I get to the next slide? I wanted a quick slide. I think the mayor and the chief also suggested that, of course, there's always room for a little disagreement in something like this. And all of the data that we had about pension plans was shared with the unions, the firefighters, the police, and they've come back with, I think, some good ideas, some constructive criticisms. But what I want to point out are just a few of the major areas where we differ. One of the biggest areas that drives your unfunded liability is something called the discount rate. And this is the rate at which we discount all of these future obligations back to the present. And this discount rate is also tied to what we expect to earn on the assets that we have in our pension fund. We have, in concert with our actuaries, concluded quite some time ago that the appropriate rate is 7.5%. This, in other words, is the rate that we believe we will continue to earn on average into the future on the assets in our pension fund. If you were to assume that the rate on those assets was going to be higher, of course that would mitigate your problem if you really believed that in the long run we could earn more than 7.5%. I believe it was the Firefighters Union looked at the data and suggested that it might be a little bit higher. Reasonable people can disagree, but I would argue that 7.5% is, in this environment, as high as you would ever want to go. And in fact, there's a whole body of research out there that would suggest that that's probably on the high end. So I don't buy any suggestion that we ought to raise that discount rate and try and mitigate a problem and make it seem smaller than it really is. We also have what is the pension asset today? How do we look at how big the problem is? A few slides ago, I referred to what is called the actuarial value of our assets. And you may have noticed if you were reading carefully that the current actuarial value of the assets is represented as a number smaller than what the market value is today. And we like to look at it that way because we're trying to figure out over very long periods of time what's the real relationship between our assets and our liabilities. If we were to use, as the firefighters would suggest, today's market value, we might fall into the trap of being captive to whatever the market value is today. Something could happen, it could go up or down wildly. So the actuarial value is more of an average or a smooth value. And we believe it's prudent to stick with that when you're trying to evaluate where do we stand in relation to assets and liabilities. So we are going to argue that today's current actuarial value is the only reasonable way to look at this, and I would suggest to you that our colleagues in Nashville will look at it the same way. Salary growth was another area that we looked at. Salaries at the end of a career is a big factor in what a person's payout is going to be in a pension plan. Our actuaries have looked at the data, and part of their analysis assumes that over time, employees for the city will have salary growth of approximately 5% per year. Now, some people might think about that and go, wow, that's a big number. Do we really give those kinds of raises? Well, we don't, but what we do is we occasionally give across-the-board raises, but this is a representation of what a typical employee's career path with step increases, promotions, etc. This includes everything from the normal increases to what a lifetime of increases might be for a typical employee who might start in the mailroom and end up as a deputy director or a lieutenant in the police force. The firefighters said that number might be lower. And I think that we've since talked to them about that. I think that they looked at data that was a much shorter period of time and included as an endpoint the year that in fact we had lowered salaries of employees by 4.6%. So we believe strongly that 5% is still the way to look at what the future holds, and in any event, what all of these things tend to do, it's not surprising to me anyway, is each one of these arguments tends to lower the unfunded liability. And I respect their efforts for trying to do that, but quite frankly, I don't think that any of those is really a prudent way to look at where we stand. But even with those changes and that different outlook, I think as the chief mentioned earlier, the folks at the firefighters still come to the conclusion that we have a very substantial problem. We have a $300 million unfunded liability, even according to folks, and that the annual arc, from their perspective, could be as high as $60 million. We believe it's in the $90 to $100 million. So anyway, that's sort of the big picture about where we believe the situation is, what the situation is on the ground. Folks who have looked at it, who might see it very, very differently, still believe that there's a very substantial problem. But we don't think that we should move in that direction. So next slide, please. As I said, there's only a disagreement on a matter of scale, $700 million unfunded liability. And at the end of the day, what all this tells me is we have a substantial issue that must be addressed, period. Consequences of inaction. There are many. One of the major ones is we've got new accounting rules that are coming down the pipe. And in years past, cities and municipalities and states used to be able to keep this unfunded liability off the books, so to speak. And next year and in all future years, this unfunded liability is going to be a liability that we have to keep on our books. The rating agencies are looking at unfunded liabilities and pension funds closer than they ever have. I think it was in the news just this past week that Moody's looked at our bond rating, as did S&P, and they both pointed out that we have a very large unfunded liability, and in fact, Moody's put a negative outlook on our bond rating. The consequences there are, of course, the bond rating determines interest rate that we will pay on all of the borrowings that we make in the future. All of the capital improvements, all the roads, all the bridges, the libraries, everything that we build, community centers, etc. If our bond rating goes down because we're not getting a grip on our pension liability, all those costs are going to go up, even to the extreme where we might eventually lose access to credit markets. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the other consequences of inaction is that the state comptroller, if we don't get a handle on this, may come in and fix it for us. Next slide, please. We're not alone. The mayor and the chief also mentioned that this is a problem. It would be difficult to not have noticed this in the papers in the last year. Nearly every city and town and state across the country is facing large unfunded liabilities. And we are also not alone in trying to get a handle on them, to try and rein in defined benefit plans and try and replace those with plans that limit those four major risks that I talked about earlier. Try to rein in mortality risk, interest rate risk, and market risk. And the examples are there, and there are many, many more. Can I go to the next slide, please? Okay, that's where we're at. Where are we today? What do we need to do? When we looked at all of this, we said, what has to change? We need a plan that's going to minimize this volatility in our annual contributions. We need balance sheet stability. We need a plan that takes out all of these guarantees that we now face, ending the fixed with the one in particular, ending the guarantee of a 62.5% average salary after only 25 years of service. At the same time, we have to have a plan that's sufficient for recruiting and retention and for providing benefits that are meaningful to our highly valued employees. So with those as our goals, we asked PwC to put some alternatives on the table. What is out there? What can we do to accomplish those goals? And you all saw that back in September. They put on the table a defined contribution plan, what's usually referred to or thought of as a 401k type plan, a cash balance plan, or a hybrid plan, which is basically a combination of the two. And over the last couple of months, I'm sure that everybody's been looking into those. We've been looking into those. I know our associations have been looking into those. Can I get the next slide, please? In a nutshell, these are the three plans. This is a page, again, out of the PwC report that you got some months ago. I'm not going to go into great detail on that again, except to say that the one is a defined contribution. A cash balance plan is a bit of a hybrid plan that's more like a defined contribution, only the fund administrator would do the investing as opposed to the individual. And then something called PPP, or Pension Preservation Plus plan, is a hybrid plan. What we concluded, though, is that there was only one of those three plans that really met all of the goals that we had to eliminate all of those risks that I talked about earlier. Can we go to the next page? And what we are recommending is that we go with a defined contribution plan. The defined contribution plan is going to be for all of our new and unvested employees. And unvested is are folks that have been with the city less than 10 years. Unlike today, the city in the defined benefit plan currently puts in 6% and the employee puts in 8%. We're recommending that the city and the employee contributions both be set at 8%. Employees will keep the 457 plan that they have today that's optional. And in this environment, any employee that feels that they personally have a greater need will be free to contribute more to their 457 plan if they feel that the total of 16% contribution, the defined contribution plan, is insufficient for their needs. Employees with 10 years of service who are vested are going to stay with the defined benefit plan. And that is approximately 60% of our employees. Our employees are going to stay in the defined benefit plan. They will not have a change in any of their benefits down the road, nor will any current retiree have any change in their defined benefit plan. The only change will be for those employees that are 10 years or less and new employees in the future. Next slide, please. Okay. So what does this mean operationally? We're going to close technically the DB plan, the defined benefit plan, and we're recommending that we close that plan as of the end of this fiscal year, June 30th. That means it will be closed, but it will not go away. It will be still alive, and we'll be paying out benefits to retirees, and contributions by the city and vested employees will continue to go into that plan, and we will manage that plan probably for another 50 or 60 years as the employees in that plan finally leave city employment and go through their retirement years. As of July 1st, we're going to enroll all unvested and new employees in the defined contribution plan. And an important thing to keep in mind is that when we make that move, all of the unvested employees who have been paying into the defined benefit plan, whatever money they have paid in, we will move over and put into the defined contribution plan. So they will all start, so to speak, with seed money for the next, hopefully, 20 or 30 years of their career. Can I have the next slide, please? This gets me into the third part of the presentation. So we've already talked about what is the situation, what's the problem. We have given the administration's recommendation about what plan we ought to move toward. And now, really, a huge part of this discussion is how do we fix all of this? Because even though we are moving to a defined, or we're recommending that we move to a defined contribution plan, we still have a very large unfunded liability that we have to take care of. The city is obligated to pay that and make sure that all the promises that we've made to retirees and vested employees are there when they are in their retirements. What we're planning on doing is we're going to take that unfunded liability, that's $700 million, we're going to amortize it over 30 years. Add to that the cost of the legacy plan, I'll call it, the continuing contributions that the city will have to make to the defined benefit plan as it slowly closes down over the next 15 years. Plus the normal costs that we will have to pay into the new defined contribution plan. All of those together are going to, the total arc on all of that is going to be approximately $100 million a year. Now, that is a very, very big gulp, and we are not recommending that we try to reach from where we are today to that level of contribution in 1 year. We are recommending that we get from where we're at to where we need to be over a 5-year period. And as we mentioned earlier, this is going to require some conversation with legislators in Nashville to make sure that they are confident in what we're doing so that they can hopefully pass any legislation that is really in harmony with what we're doing as opposed to out of harmony. So there's going to be a lot of conversation back and forth between Memphis and Nashville about this, but the early indications are from our conversations that this type of transition strategy will be acceptable. So next slide. What does that look like in hard dollars? What has to happen over the next 5 years? This is a very simple chart, but it's meant to just give you a sense of the dimension of the challenge before us. In 2014, I have sort of rounded up a little bit, and what we've got here is where we're at today is we're contributing about $20 million a year to the pension plan through a 6% withholding. And we have to get to $100 million. I'd like it if we were there today, but we're not. So the idea here is that over the next 5 years, we're going to have to stair-step our way to $100 million, increasing each year the dollars we pay to the pension plan by approximately $15–16 million. And that would be a supplement to the 6% that we're already paying. Can I have the next slide? The big question is, how do we get there? Where do we get $100 million? Where do we get $15 million a year? Well, that is going to be a conversation that's going to occur year by year in the budget process, and it's going to start with the 2015 budget. Our goal for the coming budget is to try and move expenses from other parts of the city over to the pension plan. What I have here, and it's in your books, is a real high-level look of what resources are available to us. Where are all of the tough decisions that we'll have to make? Again, today is not a day for delving into them, but just to give you some idea of, do we really have the resources there? Are there places we can go to find this amount of money? Now, in the coming weeks, we're going to get back to you, and I know there's a lot of talk about the 5-year strategic plan. You've all seen a draft of it before, but what it has in it, this is the purple part of this bar, is it has in it approximately $80 million worth of opportunities that we're going to be bringing to the council year after year as we move through this 5-year process. Those are efficiencies in departments across the city. Those are expense saves. Those are recommendations about reducing our workforce, and there's also recommendations in there about other sources of revenue, updating fines and fees, et cetera, et cetera. In addition to that, we have on the top of that bar another $30 million that is associated with our medical plans to both our current employees as well as our retirees. This, again, is not a recommendation today, but this is merely the size of the opportunity. These are the levels of cuts that we think could reasonably be made to shift dollars from these areas over to our pension obligation. And as I said at the outset, our plan is to phase these in year by year when we come to council with our annual budgets and moving cost savings from these efficiencies over to the pension plan to pay this obligation. Next slide. So in summary, we're going to implement our 5-year strategic plan initiatives, and those initiatives are going to drive the majority of the cost savings. We're going to be modernizing our medical plan as well as our OPEB benefits. And we're going to shift these cost savings to fund the unfunded pension liability. Last slide. And here's the road ahead in the near term over the next couple of months. We're here today, December 17th, and as I said, we're recommending the closure of the current defined benefit plan and the adoption of a defined contribution plan. Over the December and January, we're going to step up our conversations to determine whether or not this phase-in is acceptable to the legislature in Nashville. In February and March, we're going to develop the framework for the long-term implementation of this plan, and we're going to be working on how we're going to get these built into our 2015 budget. And then in April, you'll see the mayor's 2015 budget, and in that budget will be the efficiencies that we need to fill the first year, that first $15 or $16 million gap. So, again, no vote today. We wanted to present a very, very high-level picture of the problem, what our recommendation is for a new plan, and what all of you folks will be looking at over the next 5 years in terms of budgets. So I'll turn it back to the Chief.
In that, just to provide a context, we propose to make 2 presentations in the month of January that are related to this. One is a global presentation on the strategic plan and its various elements. I know there's been sort of everybody has the summary of the PFM recommendations, but we would actually do a formal presentation in January. And we would also do a mid-year check-in with respect to our public safety agencies, that would be police and fire, with a particular focus on the strategic initiatives as they relate to those, since that makes up a significant share of the budget. If you note also on the timeline, again, we're not asking for action at this time. The timeline would contemplate some action in terms of the ultimate course of action in the February to March timeframe, so that we could, in fact, incorporate the pension and the related pieces in the fiscal year 15 budget. The pension piece is the major driver in the 5-year budgeting plan, so it's the keystone. Everything else sort of comes off of that when you look at the order of magnitude and some sort of controlled manner of addressing this matter. With that, we conclude our remarks and open up for any questions that you may have.
Wait a minute. We got a list. I'll put you down real quick, Mr. Brown. Mr. Flynn, Strickland, and Mr. Brown. Anybody else like to be added on the list? Conrad, Boyd, Collins. All right. Anybody else? Go ahead and get on the list. Why not? All right. Anybody else? Here's the order. Flynn, Strickland, Brown, Conrad, Boyd, Collins, Halbert, Fully Love. That's 8 people. Anybody else? Well, change your mind. Go right ahead and get on the list. We'll start with Mr.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. And I guess I was diving deep into it now. Most of my questions surround the efficiencies that are supposed to pay you all that. Efficiency can be a real pretty word with some real big banana peels in there, especially when it comes to this body. So is that going to be part of the, when we get to February, we're going to get a clearer idea what that looks like? Because I don't want to see us start down this course and then have to budget, have some efficiencies that maybe we aren't going to get some votes for, and then it's all just tax increase, tax increase, tax increase.
Well, let me start with the premise that we want to avoid a tax increase at all costs. That said, the beginning of that discussion actually would be January, when we present the overview of the 5-year plan. Some of the items are fairly specific. Some of them are more general, like develop this or explore that. We're focusing on the low-hanging fruit initially that we can really talk about and really do something about. So that said, specifically with the overview of this 5-year strategic plan, that would be the first bite at it. Second bite, because clearly we've learned from even the adoption of this year's budget, would be the public safety discussion. So we can talk about in that one specifically where we are in this year versus what was budgeted. We can talk about what we're looking to year over year if we just did what we're doing now. And then also there's some initiatives that I believe that both police and fire are interested in. Present that as well. And then last but certainly not least, in terms of current year, I know we've had some things to come up that we need to go ahead and begin thinking about how we're going to address even in the current year with some unexpected expenses. So all of that would be in the January timeframe. That's going to be your major and probably your slipperiest banana peels, to use your turn of phrase.
I mean, but the budget is when all this is going to come together.
It's all got to come
That's
together
when-
in the budget. That is correct.
And I'll hold my questions till then. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Strickland, Mr. Brown has passed, so it'll be Mr. Strickland, Conrad, Boyd, Collins, Halbert, and Fully Love. Go ahead, Mr.
You said
Strickland.
the gentleman from PwC is here?
Yes.
Yeah.
What's his name?
Gerald Dubner.
Dubner? Can I ask Mr. Dubner some questions?
Sure.
D-U-B-N-E-R?
Yes.
Mr. Dubner, my name's Jim Strickland. I'm one of the 13 council members. And I've got some quick questions, but my first one is, I'm hoping that we have access to Mr. Dubner other than today, which I'm sure we do. Can we directly email him, or do you want the emails to go through?
I'd like to coordinate the contacts much as we have through the employee associations. I would ask that you contact through Director Robinson. By the way, PwC is the city's asset. It's available to all the council for any questions that you may have.
And through this process, not only, I think many of us have email questions, I think we'll probably want to talk to you at least by phone and maybe in person one more time.
Mr. Chairman, may I respond? What we would like to do, we're willing to set aside some dates on which Mr. Dubner and anybody else will just come in and block out time. So we won't have to email, and we'll do it in a public setting, however the body wishes. But they are available to do that. Sometimes emailing, you got to go back and email again. But we are more than glad to bring him and his team here. Doesn't have to be during a meeting. We'll have special sessions where we can sit down in my office or wherever and just take all the questions.
Although I will want to sometimes get email questions just because I want to have written answers. All right, Mr. Dubner, and I know we turned off the screen so it wouldn't shine in your all's eyes, but on page 10, well, I say page 10. Oh, the different alternatives, the three alternatives. In the report that you submitted several months ago, you had a chart showing that what the arc would be under different circumstances for one of these three plans. And I remember Director Collins and I talking about that chart. Can we get a chart on all three of these plans?
We can combine them on one page if you'd like.
Yeah, I just want to compare one plan to the other, which follows up my question to Mr. Dubner. Of all the permissible solutions, what has the lowest arc?
It's not an easy question to answer because the relative value or generosity of a particular plan comes into play as well.
Speak up just a little bit.
The relative generosity of a particular plan comes into play as well as the underlying plan design. For example, you could have a very generous defined contribution plan that would be more expensive on a contribution basis than a less generous defined benefit plan. So it really depends not only on the plan design, but also the level of benefits under a plan.
Can you, and not today, but can you run different scenarios on if you were trying to drive that arc as low as possible, what plan would be called for?
Yes, we can certainly run scenarios to show the projected costs under different plan designs. It would be important to set some parameters relating to the level of benefits under a particular plan or a set of plans for comparison.
What I guess I'm asking you is, can you give me those different parameters? I mean, I'm not in this industry, so I don't know if moving the retirement age up a year saves a lot of money or doesn't save a lot of money, or
Suffice it to say, there are a lot of moving pieces, or a lot of moving parts to this this whole situation, and so we can certainly, once we get parameters set, go into more detail.
And I'll, maybe that's a good one, I'll follow up with an email. On page 4 of the analysis, you went through the risk of a pension system, a defined benefit system. Is market risk the risk that most affected our current situation?
Yeah, that was my page, and that's how I would categorize that. The overall market risk that our portfolio was exposed to, and we had that very substantial decline in 2000.
On page 2, and I guess this is to Mr. Dubner, since I think this came from yours. I understand in '08, our assets went down greatly in value because of the stock market. But the stock market has more than recovered since then. Why is the number lower than it was in '08? The actuary assets number.
The reason that the asset value, both on an actuarial basis and also on a market value basis, is not recovered from a prior level, is that in looking at the net cash flows of the plan, the contributions that are being made are relatively small compared to the annual benefit payments that are made. The annual benefit payments to the plan exceed $100 million. And contributions alone don't make up that outflow of cash. The increase in the value of investments doesn't alone make up for that outflow of cash. Really, the combination of those two has not allowed the plan to reach its earlier level. If you think about the earnings on that $500 million over the last 5 years, that has been lost. And so even with an appreciation in the investments in the plan, it's not gotten back to the level that it had been.
I think you said we pay out $100 million a year.
Over $100 million.
Is that about what it was 5 years ago, or is that greatly increased?
It has been increasing over time as there are more retirees, as the benefits per retiree are greater, as there have been cost of living increases, not over the last 2 or 3 years, but as cost of living increases have been granted to retirees, the annual amount paid out from the plan has increased each year.
And do you project it will increase in the future?
Chairman Strickland, I'll speak to that point. In 2012, the plan paid out $152 billion, and to date we've paid out approximately $155 million. So the outflow is growing.
And have you projected in the future to increase?
Yes, we project that given the current status of the plan and a projection of a similar sized workforce in the future, that pension payments will increase.
Have you actually put pen to paper and figured out what that projection is?
Absolutely have.
Okay, I'm going to ask you for that in an email too. On page 6, and the reason I'm rushing is so other people have time to ask questions. On page 6, there are 4 factors, I guess, that show a difference between your opinion and the firefighters' experts' opinion. The bottom line is, it's a pretty large difference between 682 million and 301. Is there one factor among these 4, discount rate, pension asset, salary growth, and amortization method, which is larger than, which would account for more of that difference?
That's hard to say. We've not analyzed the differences and what the specific impact of the assumptions is. One of the things to keep in mind, however, is looking at this $380 million difference in the unfunded amount. you've got to realize that that's on a base of $2 billion. So 300 million out of a base of 2 billion is not twice the size. It's 10-15% overall liability. So from that standpoint, the numbers aren't, in looking at the certainly looking at the liability, the numbers aren't that vastly different.
The salary growth figure, is that 5% something your firm calculated?
That's a figure that we have determined based upon plan experience. We analyzed plan experience over quite a number of years and determined that on average, that's what over a career the annual increase is.
But that 5% is a figure your firm calculated,
Yes.
and it was based on City of Memphis data. All right, one last question, or at least for today. On page 14, and I don't know who this is to, the $90 to $100 million total cost, I think Director Collins broke it out to three subparts. There was the contribution to the current pension, there was contribution to the new plan, and I think the third one is what I've read is a transition cost.
That the third piece would be the annual payment on the unfunded liability that we've amortized over 30 years. That's $700 million.
Okay, the past.
Yeah, right. That would be 1 year's installment on that liability.
When you're changing from a defined benefit plan to a defined contribution plan, there's some kind of transition cost, because what we're going to be saying, if this passes, that all employees under 10 years and new employees will put money into their 401k plan and will not be putting money into the pension plan. And until everyone's on a 401k plan, there's a transition cost. Am I correct in that? So who's going to fill, where's that money and how much is that money that's going to go into the current pension plan that the 10-year employees and less used to put into? And isn't that called a transition cost?
Would you like to take that one, Jerry?
Sure. There is a cost associated with transition. The way the pension plan funding works, there is a liability. Contribution is based upon the net unfunded liability plus the cost of benefits accruing. And there is some flexibility there. Funding rules or what's allowed under funding, so that the overall cash cost to the city can be managed to achieve two goals. One is to achieve the long-term goal of funding the plan, but also achieve the short-term goal to not overburden the city's resources.
Okay. I'm sort of a simple-minded trial lawyer, so I don't know if I've understood anything you said. I guess when I'm of the nine, is there a transition cost in this plan that you presented to us, and how much is it?
But that's hard to say. Could I maybe back up and help you understand something too? Is that when we make this change, today when our actuaries calculate the unfunded liability also assumes a great deal about the folks that are unvested as of this point in time. So when we make a change to a defined contribution plan And those 40% of the employees, they will now be only in the defined contribution plan. And to the extent that they were previously in the defined benefit plan, the liability associated with them goes down because their model doesn't any longer assume that they'll stay in that plan for 30 years and we'll have to pay them out. So there are a lot of pluses and minuses in the background. That would be sort of a net plus. So how we fund what I'll call the legacy plan is if all else remains equal, if we pay our ARC every year associated with those legacy employees, they will continue to pay in the plan, and that will support the plan until it is terminated. Helps.
Well, through this process, I'm going to want to get more detail on that. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
I'd like to make a recommendation on that as well. Before I get to the other four members, and I do want them to have their time as well, to the chairman-elect, my recommendation would be, because I don't believe all questions will be answered in this setting, probably next year, committee being held at the whole for more questions, whatever they need to be. So council members think about that as well, and chairman-elect, I know you'll consider that and possibly make that happen. Mr. Conrad, you have the floor.
Thanks, Chairman. Thanks for the presentation. You made a good point about the challenge, whether it's 100 million there, $1 million here. It's a massive challenge, and we own it. This council owns it, and you guys own it. It happened on our watch, and it's going to define, in my view, how we attack it and fix it. And the employee unions own it as well. So we all own it together. And it's going to define one of the couple of things that will define, in my view, where the city goes at an inflection point, either this way or to kind of reach our potential that people talk about for Memphis so long. So for me, to piggyback on what Councilman Flynn said, the days of explore, we're going to develop it, we're going to do it later, that time is long past. And we are here today because of a kick-the-can governing model. And I'm not saying it's you guys' fault or our fault. I'm saying collectively, we're the board of directors, you're the CEO and the management, and this happened on all of our watches. And it's embarrassing, it's deplorable, and we put the whole city and people's lives at risk. And I think that between now and the budget season next year, we need the 5-year plan, but when it's going to happen and what's going to be done. And if we need to hire a restructuring firm or a consulting firm, whatever, to help us through this, the hole is pretty deep and the medicine is going to be pretty strong, and there's plenty of pain to go around for everybody. So I would hope that please don't bring us anything that says we're going to do this, we're going to explore this more. The time for that was years ago. And we need more from the executive branch with the staffs and what y'all do every day to manage through this over the next 5 years. And we've got to start saying no to stuff. And that's, again, what the plan, the days are gone where we can just spread it around. There's not enough peanut butter in the jar to spread it across the toast anymore. And we need to start yesterday. So I guess I'll look forward to jumping in and help fix this. But I think it's the challenge of our time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Boyd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How long has Price Waterhouse been doing the pension work in the city of Memphis?
It's been at least 20 years.
And how long have you been involved in it? Very many years?
I've been involved in it for 20 years myself.
The city of Memphis?
Yes.
Well, I have my main concern in all of this that we must correct is a most vulnerable group of the retirees. And I know I had a call last night from a 31-year retiree, city of Memphis, a former police officer. And he made the point that they were not, didn't have Social Security, input in Social Security as a city employee, so therefore, not having that, they cannot apply for Medicare. So he's not really sure what's in store for him or them. So I hope we'll really keep those people in mind whenever we make our decisions or whatever you prepare for us to chew on and decision on. That's the retirees. Thank you, Mr. Deputy.
Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too want to echo the sentiments of my colleagues by saying you guys did a great job putting this together. I do have a couple of questions, I guess, and I'll direct them to Director Collins on page 6. And I'm looking at salary growth at 5%. You mentioned the typical employee working his or her way up the ladder. And my question is, and this might be one of those that we have to get in writing for email for time purposes, could you provide me or us with an example of an employee that has worked his way up from the mailroom to deputy director or director and show me the growth in his or her income? Because I'd like to see that, and you using this 5% example.
Well, as I think Mr. Dubner also pointed out, what that is, again, it's not just the occasional 2% raise. It's a lifetime with the city. It's step increases. It's promotions. It's everything that an employee could go through. Now, we could probably go through and find some examples of that, but that's not a number I came up with. PricewaterhouseCoopers, as Mr. Dubner said a few minutes ago, they analyzed years of data and tracked not individuals, but everybody, and came up with an average over a long period of time. So any individual would be anecdotal. We could probably find somebody that had exactly a 5% growth rate, but of course it's an average.
Okay.
And it's a highly complicated algorithm to get there.
I don't want to get put on the clock. So,
Okay, sorry.
that's why I'll email, because I mean, on page 12, you talked about the 8% contribution by the city, or 2%.
Yes, sir.
Is there a law that requires us to contribute any amount, percentage to employees' retirement or benefit should they elect in this process?
We have to have a plan that is a qualified alternative to Social Security, and I think Director Robinson could talk to that better than I could. But this plan would definitely qualify as a Social Security substitute and then some.
Let me ask the question this way. Is there a minimum amount or percentage that we as a city have to contribute to an employee's retirement under this plan that you're suggesting?
Under this plan, there is not. Under this plan, the employee contribution alone, for the most part, would satisfy the conditions of this plan becoming a replacement for Social Security.
Okay. I'm looking at a page that doesn't have a number, but it says 5-year plan to close the pension gap. And it's the graph with as Councilman Strickland said, all of the numbers.
Okay.
And you mentioned several things that I want to ask specifically. You said that you would come up with different scenarios as to how we would close the gap.
Yes, sir.
The reduction in workforce, fines and fees, and I wrote outsourcing in parentheses and question mark because you didn't put that out there. Now, I don't want to put words in your mouth, because my colleagues on the council, as Councilman Conrad and Flynn would say, we've been wishing and hoping, and we finna do and I'm sure they're employing you, some of us would be employing you to make these decisions more available to us today or to now in your total presentation versus piecemealing it. For example, you said you would bring us an option or an alternative to close the $15 million gap for this fiscal budget in 15. Would it be, what would it look like if you gave us alternatives going forward in your 5-year strategic plan, not only for 15, but for 16 and 17 and 18, so that all of us would have an opportunity to see it and then make determinations under full disclosure? That might be something. Can you answer that? Or Mr. Mayor, you
I will
want-
answer that. That is precisely what the presentation in January will do.
So it won't be just a 1-year gap. It'll be for fiscal year 15 going forward in the
That's why,
5-year plan.
that's why.
That's not what you said.
That's not what we heard, though.
But it's going to be year to year. We will have the plan there. Obviously, we budget from year to year, but we will have it outlined there. Obviously, budgeting year to year, you cannot, well, I guess you could, it wouldn't be binding, but we will have it laid out there, but you will bite off a year at a time, and boom, that becomes it. But you will, we're going to give it to you in the first year, so you will know what impact it will have on the second year, and what the second year will have on the third year. There won't be any surprise. Oh, if we had known that in year 1, we would not have done that. So, no. It will be spread over 5 years, but you will have it in front of you, but you cannot implement it. It will be subject to debate. That's what I believe someone said.
I believe I said that.
Yeah,
Okay.
but, and we always do that.
Okay.
Right.
And my last question, Mr. Chairman, is to Mr. Dubner. On page 41 of under tab number 5, which is, I guess, labeled PwC report and recommendation. Page 41. Under the 3rd paragraph. Did you, let me ask, first of all, did you write this disclaimer?
Yes.
So the calculations performed in this analysis is based upon assumptions regarding future events. However, the plan's long-term costs will be determined by actual future events, which may differ materially from assumptions that were made. What does that mean?
Which means is
That's on
tab
page
5,
41.
tab 5.
41, on 3rd paragraph.
What it means is that although we make our best efforts based on projections on future events and the likelihood of future events, we cannot guarantee that they come to pass.
The mayor wants to answer that.
Councilman, you know well that the lawyers told him to put that in there. And,
Jim Strickland, did you tell them to put that in there? And so I'm gonna wait and defer everything till we have one-on-ones, because, you know, I understand where we're going, but I just, you know, come on, y'all.
You done, Mr. Collins?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry.
And my 2 ladies next. Who wants to go first? Okay, alphabetical order, Ms. Fuller.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr.
You went that way, Mr. Dubner.
Mr. Dudley, on page 6, on one of the key elements of analysis and potential disagreement, you have the firefighter's position, and then, of course, there's the city of Memphis position, and, of course, it differs greatly, especially with unfunded liability. I guess my question is, where did the firefighters get their information to even come up with the data that they have?
We provided them with the same data that we used in our analysis.
And can you, with all of your 20 years of experience, even understand why there's such a gap between your assessments and these?
Yes, often disagreement about certain assumptions and the appropriateness of assumptions. For example, the discount rate. We base the discount rate on a historical rate that we've used for many years, and a rate that we believe is appropriate. I believe that the calculation by the actuary engaged by the firefighters used a rate that is an average rate used by other cities, not a rate specific to the city of Memphis. The asset value differs by a couple $100 million between the actuarial value of assets and the market value of assets. We believe that a smooth value, one that does not jump around every time the market changes, is a more appropriate measure to use as closer to true value of assets. It doesn't change significantly from one day to the next. That there are differences of opinion as to which value is a more appropriate value to use, and that's a couple $100 million right there as far as the difference.
Now, let me ask you this. Did you work with our finance division on this presentation?
Yes, we prepared it.
No other outside sources?
We also work with human resources.
I mean, outside of the city of Memphis. Okay. One other question I have, and it's on page, well, it doesn't say what page it's on, but it deals with a 5-year plan to close the pension gap. And I don't have my glasses on, so forgive me. But it says something here about 21 million of savings associated with the redesign of our OPEB retirement medical plan. Just like Councilman Boyd, I received a call from a retiree who had been on the police department for a number of years, and he was very concerned that the city is going to take away the retirees' medical plan and just kind of leave them out there. Is this where this 21 million in savings is going to come from?
Councilwoman Phillip, I'll take that one. We recognize that historically there have been scores of employees retired from the city of Memphis without having participated in Medicare, having paid into Medicare, so they don't qualify for Medicare. We would continue to carry those individuals in our city retiring medical.
Are we going to discuss that tomorrow?
If I may, yes.
Yes.
And in fact, going back to my earlier comments and the questions I believe were comments from Councilman Conrad and Collins, we're going to, when we do the 5-year plan presentation and subsequent discussions, we'll get into those issues. That's on the list of issues and just side conversations I've had. I mean, we're going to be in conversation with everybody around not only the near term, but the longer term recommendations. So none of this is etched in stone. We have contingencies around this particular issue, but I know there are a host of others once we start getting down into the weeds. So we're going to talk about it some more.
Yeah, because that's just not fair. I mean, to eliminate retirees' medical coverage. Yeah. And even their, and even the, I can't,
Spousal.
even the, is it spousal coverage? That's not fair at all. Oh, no, I'm not. That's not fair, and I certainly hope that we can come up with some other ways other than hurting the ones who've given so much of their time and service to this city, thinking that they're gonna be taken care of because they took care of the city, than to, would you want your mama that happen to your mama? No. No, you would not. No further questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Albert. And then Mr. Harris, and then Mr. Boyd a second time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I won't be long, and I think I have more comments for the administration and kind of take back some notes. Councilman Conrad talks about how this happened under our watch and how we all have to accept responsibility. A lot of you weren't here. We had some different faces at the beginning of this. I think 2008 is the year that this was cited. And acknowledging that the market crashed, in addition to the fact that the city wasn't necessarily contributing the money the actuaries said that we should have been contributing, and I'm sure that was based on a number of other factors, you know. But one, we do want to acknowledge that in this whole scheme of things, the employees were doing what they were supposed to. They were contributing what they were asked to contribute. But even when the administration, whether it was the administration before you or this current administration, even when we knew that we were extremely challenged in this area, we continued investing money in different projects. Sometimes these projects just kind of fell out of the sky. We also invested in different initiatives. And one of the things that we cannot forget as a council and as an administration is when we make these major capital investments, it has a major impact on the operations budget. But I don't recall us really getting any type of reports that shows us what is the hit to the operation budget when we make a capital investment. Because if I don't see that, then I don't know. I mean, we just keep hearing that we're running short of money. We've got to increase fees. We've got to reduce services. We've got to lay off employees. But I don't recall seeing a report that significantly tells me when I invest in the Redbird Stadium, Sears Crosstown, Southbrook Mall, how does that investment impact my operations budget and the overall financial condition of the city of Memphis? And I would like you all to consider doing that. Councilman Conrad also said we've got to start saying no. And, you know, and I'm just going to respectfully say to everyone in this room, that seems to be very difficult when it comes to special projects or pet projects. We don't have a problem saying no to everyday needs of the 700+ thousand citizens of Memphis who complain about blight, who complain about street repair, who complain about lack of certain services or the reduction in certain services. But then we don't have a problem investing in some of these things like the Hammerhand Bridge. You know, great idea, wonderful initiative, but am I going to be riding my bike or walking across the bridge, or am I going to be riding my bike or walking across the sidewalk in the city of Memphis? So those are some things that I'd like for you all to consider, because for me as a council member, when you tell me that I have a $740 million deficit in my pension plan, then I'm trying to figure out, well, why was I paying all of that money for some of these other things? And a lot of them didn't have a whole lot of anything to do with the everyday life of the citizens of Memphis. I clearly understand that we are addressing an outdated pension plan designed and developed in 1948. Things are different than they were back then. It's my understanding also that this new proposal we're proposing a new plan for new employees and those who have been employed 10 years or less. But I do want to see, for those who have invested for the last 5, 7, 10 years, instead of just simply moving them to a new plan, what are we going to do to make them whole? Because then you don't want to feel like, okay, I've been here 10 years, I gave up another job or another opportunity, I've made this investment, and all of a sudden you're changing that right up under my feet. We've got to make sure that we make them whole in some kind of way if we're going to move towards changing what they initially got hired for. And then making up the deficit. Understand we've got to do that, but I keep saying this, Mayor, the 5-year, Councilman Collins mentioned the 5-year strategic plan. You all, every time we put an issue on this table, whether it's the pension, whether it's a project, we need to clearly understand how is it going to impact the 5-year plan, and we still have yet to see that. I want to know, how is this pension issue going to impact what projects can be done throughout our communities, our city? I mean, what employees are we going to be able to hire? we haven't heard that piece of it yet. And then finally, for me, in an effort to eliminate flipping through all of these pages, as we continue to talk about this issue, can you develop a summary page that is modified when we get together? Because all of this flipping, you know, I need to clearly articulate and understand, be able to understand, articulate to the public what exactly is happening. And if I got to go through hundreds and hundreds of pages, I'm going to lose something. And this is a critical issue. I will tell you, in 2008, I shared with Director Collins that the only major financial issue that I recall us seriously discussing and debating was the funding to Memphis City Schools, the now defunct Memphis City Schools. We did not hear in detail this issue about the pension plan, and that's unfortunate. But I do want to commend you, Director Collins, because never, in the 6 years that I've sat on this council, never has finance pulled me to the side and talked to me in the manner about that you have about the dire sense of urgency that we have with this plan. It may have been mentioned, but nothing that articulated clearly where we've been, where we are, and where we need to go. So I thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Quick point of information.
Question from who?
Councilman Howard. A couple years ago, I made a very in-depth presentation on all this. And I think last year or 2 years ago, everybody got together and we didn't do enough, and it wouldn't have been enough even what was being proposed then, but we did some pension changes 2 years ago. So I don't know, where you were for that, but there was a major presentation and many meetings and some things were done. The retirement age was raised. So this clearly has been an issue for everybody, and it has been on the forefront of our agenda.
Mr. Chair, if I may, and I've said this before too, when we sit in this room and when we sit behind that platform downstairs, we are elected legislators. Councilman Conrad, Fully Love, Brown, you're not the attorney for the city government, you're not the mayor, you're not the finance director. The people we need to hear this from are the administrators. And they have the responsibility to report these issues. They have the responsibility to run the day-to-day operations. And we just need to make sure when you know those issues, great. Make sure the administration, because I don't know. I know you're in business. I've never seen your resume or your dossier of accomplishments, and I don't question them. But the person who needs to tell me about the city of Memphis pension problems is the HR director, the mayor, and the finance director. But thank you for that.
I'm just saying, maybe I misheard you, but to say that the director of finance and administration's never come to us, or we've never talked about the pension issue.
No, you did misunderstand. We have talked about it, but not in this manner, sir, because I've not heard it. I've heard some discussion about it.
What do you mean, not in this manner?
At this point,
All right.
my commentary is directed toward the administration. City council members can't present anything to me when it comes to the people who get paid the day-to-day dollars to make those presentations to me. Thank you.
Let's move on to the next person who has not spoken yet, and we'll go back to other people. It is 2:43. We still have 2 other items, people. So for the individuals that are trying to speak a second time, let's try to make sure that we cut it to as minimal as possible. Mr. Harris, you're the only one that's not spoken.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Chair, and I'll try to be brief. I think I only have 2 or 3 questions here. First, I commend you guys for bringing this discussion to the table and the level of detail that's in the various reports. I think this is helpful and it's appreciated. I know there's a lot of work in it and it shows here. There's one thing that's missing here, and I would press you guys to please offer the details as soon as possible, and that is for the $80 million efficiencies. I know that's been mentioned before, but there are $80 million efficiencies mentioned here, and I think we don't want any, I don't know what they call them, October surprises? I don't know what they call them. But we don't want any surprises with respect to that. So I would say rip the Band-Aid off those efficiencies as soon as possible and give us some categories of exactly what those look like. Because I think those are tough to swallow, like Mr. Conrad said, or I don't know, somebody said. But I think the sooner we get those on the table, then the sooner we can actually have a full and frank discussion. So encourage about that. My couple questions. One was, $680 million is, all of this is about unfunded liability. $682 million is unfunded liability. That seems to me that's the number that has always been mentioned, right? And so I'm trying to understand, how do we take half of our employees or 40% of our employees out of the mix, right? There's no liability associated with them. That's the proposal. We take half of them out of the mix, and the liability stays the same, even though half of our employees are removed from the mix. How's that work? I'm just trying to understand that conceptually.
If I may, that's a great question.
And we've got,
You want to try?
The liability associated with defined benefit plan to defined contribution plan, that will go away. That liability will be transferred to a different plan. The fact is that there will still remain a liability for the vested employees, and that will need to continue to be funded over time. There will be less in the way of employee contributions and likely a higher percentage for those employees to be those employees payroll to fund the plan going forward. But the dollar amount of the unfunded liability will decrease.
It will decrease from 680 million to something else.
Yes.
Do you know what that liability is?
I don't have that figure in front of me right now.
Okay. The other thing is, I'm just going to keep dealing with the $680 million number, because that's the number that's so far represented as the liability under the proposal, which you say should change if we do the proposal. But $680 million is a present value number, and you've given a proposal that says sock away $100 million in the bank, right? As I understand it, and I'm trying to, if I sock away $100 million in the bank, then I cover a $680 million liability in 7 years or 8 years. So I'm just trying to understand, how long do we have to put $100 million in the bank in order to cover a $700 or $680 million liability? How long do we have to do that for? Why would it be 30 years instead of 7 years? And if that's too complicated, we can talk about it another time. I'm just, if there's an easy answer, that's all I'm asking, because I know there's time constraints.
There's not an easy answer to that.
Okay, that's fine. Let's move on then. Okay, let's move on.
It's not easy.
Okay, the other one that may be easy is just a straightforward one, just the last one. Can you use CIP dollars to cover any of this liability? That's an easy one. Okay, I'm done. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We'll now go back to other council members who have spoken already. Again, let's be mindful of time. We still have 2 items. And we need to start at 3:30 downstairs. Mr. Boyd, and then Mr. Brown, are you trying to speak again? Okay, while he's thinking, Mr. Boyd.
Real quick, Mr. Chair. This for Director Robinson. I was just curious, how many people, how many retirees are in the pension plan? How many current employees, vested employees are in the plan?
The number of current employees in the plan, the unvested number is 2,428. The vested number is 3,707. Total number of retirees receiving pensions is about 3,500.
Thank you.
Mr. Brown.
I want to say, thank you, Chairman. I think that what the administration, the city council body,
The legislative body.
the employees and the retirees basically feel that they being emotionally extorted. And it's emotional extortion per se. We're not working. You got to work in the best interest of all of the associates of the city, which is employees. And I'm being, respectfully, I'm being upfront here. It's a scenario that's being presented as it's putting a tremendous strain on the
on their mental health, and some of them their physical health. Just like the elimination of retirees' medical coverage, and elimination of retirees' dependent medical coverage. Every retiree who have a spouse, they're concerned about that. There's certain things that we just can't take out. And we don't want to, what I'm saying is that basically you're supposed to work for the good. We're dealing with the employees. The only thing this council, the only thing the body, where cost savings can be saved is on the backs of the employees and the retirees. We need to become more innovative and consistently support the employees and the retirees. It's not gonna jail. I mean, I can't sit here comfortably as a legislator and be indifferent on the employees and the retirees of the city. I think that we could come to some better medium on how we're gonna do this. Just respectfully, Dublin, or like Ireland. I guess I missed it, but anyway, the thing is that actually some of the organizations that represent labor organizations and associations respectfully don't respect your numbers. And that's a norm. And that's respectful. They don't respect the numbers. They had the actuaries who come in and they got different numbers. Most labor organizations have different numbers. Associations has different numbers. Something ain't gelling, Mr. Mayor. But I mean, respectfully, you do what you do because you work for Price Waterhouse, and I understand that. But at the same time is we got to come to a consensus where we can respectfully take care of the associates, which is the employees of the city, our public safety employees as well. First thing is, what makes me want to be a cop, a policeman, if I know there's no incentives there? You're going to put me in a 401 rather than now in the city's regular defined pension plan. Number one, this reminds me of going back to the year of 1968. Long before that, when the sanitation workers would refuse a pension plan, a pension program for the retirement program for the sanitation workers. Miss Dorothy is dead. She was the attorney for the city at that time. She stayed here quite a long time, I think until after Mayor Harrison. But at the time, those employees could not read. Some of them couldn't read. They weren't comprehensive enough to understand what was being put on the table. But truly, if we think about this today, you still got sanitation workers who work for the city of Memphis that's not in a retirement program for the city. Now, Mr. Mayor, you're an attorney. What I see is class action lawsuit against the city of Memphis. Not just because it's your watch, but on the entire, because they were totally done unfair. This is the only city that I can think of where every other city employee is in a pension plan, but one group is not. That's very discriminatory. But we back here at the table now want to take out some of our employees, you know. They can only be vested after a certain amount, well, they can't be vested anymore into the regular pension plan. We're going to have 401s. 401s are not solid. But the plans we have are solid. So something we just got to think about, but actually, that's what they say. That's what people call it. They do call council members. And the thing is that they feel that they being emotional. Thank you very much. Respectfully.
Mr. Strickland, close us off.
Two quick questions. Of the approximate 3,500 retirees, do you know how many are Medicare eligible?
We have, so the retirees that we have who are in the medical plan, those who have Medicare and those who don't, split about 50-50. 2,065 of our retirees who are in the medical plan have Medicare. And then there's 1,985 non-Medicare retirees. This includes a group of folks who are post-65 as well as retirees who are too young to receive that.
All right, and just a request, do you all have something in writing? I know there's the 48 plan, the 78 plan, and the 2011 one. Do you have a 1 or 2 page summary on those different plans?
We can provide them.
Council, before you get it, it is the hardest thing in the world to read. It's jumbled up. We will get it to you. I tried to read it. Good luck to you if you can.
Okay. Thank you all.
All right, hopefully the chairman-elect will take the recommendation of having committee meetings as a whole to finish up this, well, to continue and hopefully finish up this conversation. So I know there were others in the audience that would like to speak on this, but we're going to move on because we have 2 items. And the next item is, and I'm sorry, before we go to that, everyone that presented, thank you very much for presenting on this item. Item number 2 is a monthly update on the sexual assault kit backlog. Mr. Conrad, I know this is your item, so I'll yield to you. And if you want to use it.
Sure, no,